My golden brother drained the family company, and my parents still demanded I gift him half of mine. Chapter 1: The Invisible Son. Callahan had learned early that there were different kinds of invisible. The kind where you had nothing and people looked right through you because you didn't register as worth their time. Then there was his kind, where you had something real, something you'd built with your own hands, but your family dismissed it so thoroughly that you might as well have been a ghost haunting their perfectly appointed rooms. He'd grown up in Bergen County, where the real estate empire his grandfather built had become the family religion. The Mercer name meant something in northern New Jersey. It meant developments that transformed neighborhoods, commercial properties that anchored downtown districts, and investment portfolios that weathered recessions. It meant his parents drove matching Range Rovers and hosted charity galas where they wrote checks that made people gasp and applaud. It also meant that when Callahan chose woodworking over acquisitions, when he rented a workshop in Patterson instead of taking an office at Mercer Properties, he became the family embarrassment. The son they mentioned reluctantly at dinner parties, if they mentioned him at all. His older brother Blaine had ascended to vice president of acquisitions by 32, a position that came with a corner office, an expense account, and their father's constant approval. Blaine identified properties, negotiated deals, and closed transactions that added millions to the company's portfolio. At least that was the story told at every family gathering. Blaine wore Italian suits and drove a Tesla. Blaine dated women who looked like they'd stepped out of fashion magazines. Blaine was everything their parents had hoped for in a son. His sister Delaney handled investor relations, which meant she spent her days schmoozing wealthy clients and her evenings at networking events where champagne flowed and deals were struck with handshakes. She had their mother's charm and their father's ruthlessness, a combination that made her devastatingly effective at separating people from their money. She'd recently gotten engaged to a hedge fund manager, and their mother had already booked the country club for next June. Then there was Callahan, 30 years old, working in a converted warehouse space that smelled of sawdust and wood stain. His hands bore calluses and occasional cuts. His clothes were practical, durable, chosen for function rather than impression. He drove a 10-year-old truck because he needed to transport materials and finished pieces. He lived in a modest apartment in Montclair because he'd rather invest in his business than maintain appearances. His parents called his furniture business a hobby. They'd been calling it that for 6 years, ever since he'd walked away from the family company after a single miserable year of trying to fit into their world. They said it with patient smiles, as if indulging a child who insisted on playing with blocks instead of studying for medical school. They asked when he'd be ready to do something serious with his life, when he'd stop this woodworking phase and join the real family business. Last year, his custom furniture business had generated $140,000 in revenue. He'd paid himself a reasonable salary, reinvested in equipment and materials, and still managed to save. He had a waiting list of clients who appreciated craftsmanship, who understood the difference between mass-produced furniture and pieces built to last generations. He'd been featured in a regional design magazine. A boutique hotel in Hoboken had commissioned him to furnish their entire lobby. None of it mattered to his parents. At Thanksgiving, his mother had introduced him to a family friend as someone who was still finding himself. His father had suggested again that he could always come work in property management if the hobby thing didn't work out. Blaine had made a joke about manual labor being character building, and everyone had laughed except Callahan and his grandmother, who'd squeezed his hand under the table. His grandmother understood. She'd watched her husband build the company from nothing, back when it meant actual labor, actual risk, actual creation rather than just moving money around and calling it success. She visited Callahan's workshop sometimes, running her weathered hands over the pieces he'd made, asking questions about joinery and finish techniques. She was the only one who'd ever asked to see his books, who nodded approvingly at his profit margins and client retention rates. The toxic dynamics had calcified over the years into something almost ritualistic. Every family gathering followed the same pattern. His parents would ask about his hobby with thinly veiled concern. Blaine would mention another successful deal. Delaney would discuss her latest investor coup. Callahan would endure it quietly, knowing that defending himself only made it worse, only gave them more ammunition to paint him as defensive and insecure about his choices. He'd stopped trying to explain that he made more than many of their junior employees, that his business was growing steadily, that he had something they'd never understand, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional with his own hands. They didn't want to understand. His success outside their empire was somehow more threatening than if he'd simply failed and come crawling back. Christmas was approaching, and Callahan had already received the formal invitation to the family dinner, embossed cardstock with elegant calligraphy. His mother had called twice to confirm he was coming, which was unusual. Typically, they assumed his attendance with the same certainty they assumed the sun would rise. The extra attention made him uneasy, but he'd agreed to come anyway. He always did. Some stubborn part of him kept hoping that eventually they'd see him clearly. He had no idea they'd already planned his intervention. Chapter 2: The Christmas Ambush. Callahan arrived at the family estate 3 hours early, as requested. His mother had called asking if he could help with preparations, which should have been his first warning. The Mercers didn't prepare for events themselves. They hired people for that. But she'd sounded almost warm on the phone, mentioning how nice it would be to spend some time together before the chaos of dinner, and he'd foolishly interpreted it as an olive branch. The house looked like a Christmas catalog had exploded across its facade. White lights dripped from every eave, wreaths hung on every door, and through the windows he could see a tree that had to be 14 feet tall, professionally decorated in silver and gold. His truck looked painfully out of place in the circular driveway next to his father's Range Rover and Delaney's Mercedes. He let himself in through the side entrance, calling out as he entered. No response. The house had that peculiar silence of a large space temporarily empty, though he could hear distant movement upstairs. He headed toward the kitchen, figuring he'd find his mother directing caterers or arranging flowers. Instead, he found the dining room transformed into what looked like a corporate war room. The long mahogany table was covered with printed materials, all facing the same direction as if arranged for an audience. At the head of the table sat a laptop connected to the projector screen they used for his father's occasional business presentations. The screen displayed a title slide in corporate blue and gray, Callahan Career Trajectory, a family investment strategy. His stomach dropped. Callahan moved closer, his footsteps silent on the Persian rug. The printed materials were arranged in neat stacks, enough copies for what looked like the entire extended family. He picked up the nearest packet, his hands suddenly cold despite the house's warmth. The first page outlined his current situation in bullet points that made his jaw clench. Annual income, $45,000. Business model, unsustainable. Client base, limited and unstable. Future prospects, declining market for luxury handmade furniture. Each point was accompanied by a small chart or graph, all professionally designed to look authoritative and damning. Except it was all lies. He made $140,000, not $45,000. His client base was growing, not declining. His business model had been profitable for 4 consecutive years. He pulled out his phone and started photographing everything, his heart hammering. The second page detailed what they called intervention strategies. His father would present the financial analysis. His mother would share her concerns about his isolation and lack of professional network. Blaine would offer a position at Mercer Properties with a starting salary of $85,000, framed as rescue from his failing business. Delaney would discuss the emotional toll his stubbornness was taking on the family. The third page assigned roles to extended family members. Uncle Richard would share how he'd also had a creative phase in his 20s before getting serious. Aunt Patricia would mention knowing several talented craftsmen who'd successfully transitioned to real estate. Cousin Jennifer would express concern about his retirement planning. It was choreographed humiliation, designed to corner him in front of everyone he'd known since childhood. Callahan flipped to the next section, his hands shaking now. This part detailed the proposed merger of his business into Mercer Properties. They'd create a new division called Mercer Artisan Furnishings, with Callahan as a salaried employee. The document outlined how they'd absorb his client list, his vendor relationships, his reputation. They'd even designed a logo. The final pages revealed the real motivation, a financial. Analysis showed Mercer Properties could leverage his established client relationships and his growing reputation to break into the luxury residential market. They projected his contacts could generate $2 million in new business within 18 months. There was a detailed plan for how they'd market his work under their brand, how they'd scale production by outsourcing to cheaper manufacturers while trading on his name and craftsmanship. They weren't trying to save him. They were trying to save themselves by stealing everything he'd built. Callahan photographed every page, every slide, every damning detail. His hands steadied as anger replaced shock. He advanced through the PowerPoint presentation on the laptop, finding slides he hadn't seen in the printed materials. One showed a timeline, the intervention tonight, a cooling-off period through New Year's, then a formal signing ceremony in mid-January where he'd transfer his business assets to the family company. Another slide listed potential objections he might raise and scripted responses for each family member. If he mentioned his actual income, his father would suggest he was inflating numbers or confusing revenue with profit. If he refused the offer, his mother would tearfully ask why he was rejecting their help. If he got angry, Blaine would express concern about his emotional stability. They'd plan for everything except the possibility that he'd discover their scheme before they sprung it. The sound of a door closing upstairs snapped him back to the moment. Callahan quickly returned the materials to their original positions, closed the laptop, and slipped out of the dining room. He made it to the kitchen just as his mother descended the stairs, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She smiled when she saw him, the same patient smile she'd worn for years when discussing his hobby. He smiled back, his phone heavy in his pocket with the weight of 43 photographs that would destroy this entire charade. Chapter 3, Uncovering the Truth. Callahan left the estate claiming he'd forgotten something at his workshop, promising to return for dinner. His mother barely registered his departure, already distracted by the caterers arriving with trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. He drove straight to his apartment, his mind racing faster than the truck's engine. Something about the presentation nagged at him beyond the obvious betrayal. The desperation underlying it, the elaborate planning, the sheer audacity of trying to absorb his business. This wasn't just about controlling him or proving their superiority. This was about survival. He spread the photographs across his kitchen table, studying them with fresh eyes. The financial projections kept mentioning leveraging his contacts and reputation to generate new business. Why would Mercer Properties, supposedly thriving, need his modest client list so desperately? They'd always dismissed his work as insignificant, yet now they were projecting millions in revenue from it. Callahan opened his laptop and started digging. His grandmother had taught him years ago that public records told stories people tried to hide. Property transactions, court filings, business registrations, all of it was there if you knew where to look. The first crack appeared in a county clerk's database. Mercer Properties had sold 3 commercial buildings in the past 18 months, all at prices below market value. Quick sales usually meant cash flow problems. He cross-referenced the buyers and found shell companies with addresses that led to registered agents, the kind of corporate anonymity that suggested something worth hiding. He pulled up the state business registry and started tracing connections. One shell company had been registered by someone named Blake Morrison, who shared an address with Blaine's luxury apartment building. Another listed a registered agent whose phone number, when he searched it, appeared in online reviews for restaurants where Blaine frequently posted photos on social media. Callahan's hands stilled on the keyboard. His brother wasn't just working for the family company, he was stealing from it. The next 3 hours disappeared as he followed the trail deeper. Property records showed Mercer Properties selling buildings to shell companies, which then flipped them weeks later at significantly higher prices. The difference between what Mercer received and what the properties actually sold for amounted to hundreds of thousands per transaction. Someone was pocketing the difference, and all roads led back to Blaine. He found falsified acquisition records where properties were purchased at inflated prices from vendors that didn't seem to exist beyond paperwork. The money went out, but the properties never materialized, or when they did, they were worth far less than the purchase price. More money disappearing into the void. Contract records revealed a pattern of Mercer Properties hiring subcontractors for renovation work at premium rates, but the actual work was either never completed or done by different companies at fraction of the cost. The invoices were elaborate fictions, the payments real, the destinations obscure. Callahan created a spreadsheet tracking every suspicious transaction he could find. The numbers grew staggering. Over 2 years, more than $3 million had been diverted from Mercer Properties through various schemes, all of them bearing Blaine's fingerprints. His brother had been systematically bleeding the company dry while maintaining the appearance of success. That explained everything. The company was failing, hemorrhaging money and clients as word spread about missed deadlines and cost overruns. His parents couldn't admit their golden child was a thief, couldn't face that their empire was crumbling. So they decided to cannibalize Callahan's legitimate business instead, using his reputation and client relationships as a transfusion for their dying company. They'd planned to fold his business into theirs, absorb his assets, and use his credibility to mask their failures. He'd become the scapegoat if it didn't work and the invisible savior if it did, never receiving credit because they'd own everything he'd built. Callahan sat back, his apartment dark except for the laptop's glow. His phone showed it was nearly 6. Dinner started at 7. He should be furious, should be planning to expose them immediately. Instead, he felt something colder and more focused settling into his chest. His grandmother had always said that information was only powerful if you knew when to use it. Revealing everything now in private would let them regroup and spin the story. They'd claim he was lying, that he'd misunderstood, that his jealousy of Blaine had made him paranoid. But if he let them proceed with their intervention, if he let them present their lies in front of the entire extended family, and then systematically dismantled every false claim with documentation they couldn't dispute, that would be different. That would be permanent. Callahan printed everything. Bank records, property transactions, shell company registrations, the timeline of Blaine's embezzlement, the evidence of the company's real financial situation. He organized it into a folder that mirrored the structure of their presentation about him, a dark reflection of their carefully planned ambush. He showered, dressed in the one good suit he owned, and drove back to the estate. His truck's headlights swept across the circular driveway, now crowded with the vehicles of extended family members arriving for Christmas dinner. Through the windows, he could see people gathering, champagne glasses catching the light from the enormous tree. They were all assembled, waiting for the show. Callahan grabbed his folder and headed inside, ready to give them a performance they'd never forget. Chapter 4: The Confrontation. The dining room. Blazed with candlelight and crystal, 23 family members arranged around the extended table like players in a carefully staged production. Callahan took his assigned seat near the middle, the folder resting innocuously on his lap beneath the white linen tablecloth. His grandmother caught his eye from across the table and offered the smallest nod, her sharp gaze missing nothing. Dinner proceeded with excruciating normalcy. Servers circulated with wine and appetizers. Aunt Patricia dominated conversation with stories about her recent Mediterranean cruise. Uncle Richard held forth on interest rates and market predictions. Delaney's engagement ring caught the light every time she lifted her champagne flute, which seemed deliberately frequent. Blaine sat at their father's right hand, looking relaxed and confident in a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Callahan ate mechanically, tasting nothing. His mother kept glancing toward his father with barely contained anticipation. She'd orchestrated this moment for weeks, maybe months, and her excitement was palpable beneath her practiced composure. Finally, as servers cleared the main course, his father stood and tapped his wine glass with a knife. The crystal chime silenced the table instantly. Everyone turned toward him with the automatic deference the family patriarch commanded. "Before we move to dessert, Margaret and I have something we'd like to share," his father began, his voice carrying the authoritative warmth he used for board presentations. "As you all know, family is the foundation of everything we've built. The Mercer name means something because we support each other, invest in each other, and sometimes have difficult conversations because we care." Callahan's mother rose, moving to the sideboard where the laptop waited. The projector hummed to life, casting the title slide across the wall, "Callahan Career Trajectory, a Family Investment Strategy." A few confused murmurs rippled around the table. Cousin Jennifer looked genuinely puzzled. His grandmother's expression hardened into something carved from granite. "We've been concerned about Callahan for some time," his mother said, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "He's talented, certainly, but talent alone doesn't guarantee success. We've watched him struggle with his small business, and as his family, we can't stand by and watch him fail when we have the resources to help." The presentation advanced. Charts appeared showing his supposed $45,000 income, graphs depicting declining market share, projections of inevitable business failure. His father provided commentary, each statement delivered with the confidence of someone presenting irrefutable facts. Callahan let them continue. He watched faces around the table shift from confusion to concern to pity. Aunt Patricia made sympathetic noises. Uncle Richard nodded gravely. Several cousins exchanged knowing glances, the kind that said they'd always suspected his woodworking thing wouldn't work out. Blaine stood when prompted, launching into his prepared speech about the position they'd created for him at Mercer Properties. "We're family," Blaine said, his voice rich with false sincerity. "We take care of our own. This isn't charity, Cal, it's an investment in your future." The presentation reached the slide showing the proposed merger, the Mercer Artisan Furnishings logo, the timeline for transferring his business assets. His mother was openly crying now, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. His father looked appropriately solemn, a man making difficult decisions for someone he loved. "We know this might feel overwhelming," his father said, "but we're asking you to trust us. Trust your family. Let us help you build something sustainable instead of watching you struggle alone." The table had gone completely silent. 21 pairs of eyes turned toward Callahan, waiting for his response. Some looked sympathetic, others uncomfortable, a few openly curious about how he'd react to this public intervention. Callahan set down his wine glass with deliberate care. He pulled the folder from his lap and placed it on the table in front of him. "That's a compelling presentation," he said quietly. "Very professional. I especially appreciated the charts, though I noticed some discrepancies in the data." His father's expression flickered just for a moment. "Callahan, I know this is hard to hear. My actual income last year was $140,000, Callahan continued, his voice steady and clear. "Not 45,000. I have tax returns, bank statements, and client contracts to prove it. Would anyone like to see them?" He opened the folder and pulled out the first set of documents, sliding them toward the nearest cousin, who took them with uncertain hands. The papers began circulating around the table, confusion spreading like ripples in water. "I also have photographs of this entire presentation, which I found this afternoon when I arrived early to help with preparations. I documented every slide, every printed handout, every assigned role in this carefully choreographed ambush." He pulled out his phone, advancing through the images. "Uncle Richard, you were supposed to share how you had a creative phase in your 20s. Aunt Patricia, you were going to mention craftsmen who successfully transitioned to real estate. Everyone had a script." His mother had gone pale, his father's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "You're upset, which is understandable, but you're misinterpreting our intentions." "The real question," Callahan said, his voice cutting through his father's deflection, "is why Mercer Properties needs my small, supposedly failing business so desperately. Why project $2 million in new revenue from my modest client list? Unless, of course, the company is in serious financial trouble." Blaine stood abruptly. "That's ridiculous. Our quarterly reports show properties being sold at below-market rates to shell companies that flip them weeks later at significant profits," Callahan interrupted. He pulled out another stack of documents. "Shell companies registered to addresses connected to you, Blaine. I have property records, business registrations, and transaction histories showing more than $3 million diverted from Mercer Properties over 2 years." The silence that fell over the table was absolute, suffocating. His grandmother leaned forward, her eyes glittering with something between vindication and fury. "I was asked for a substantial loan 6 weeks ago," she said, her voice cutting through the shocked quiet. $200,000 for what was described as a temporary cash flow issue. I declined and began asking questions that were deflected and dismissed." She looked directly at her son. "I've suspected embezzlement for months." Chaos erupted. Uncle Richard demanded to see the documents. Aunt Patricia started asking rapid-fire questions about the company's actual financial state. Cousins pulled out phones, some already standing to leave. Delaney sat frozen, her champagne flute forgotten, her engagement ring suddenly seeming less brilliant. Callahan's father tried to regain control, his voice rising over the commotion, but the authority he'd commanded minutes earlier had evaporated. His mother reached for Callahan's arm, her tears now genuine, but he stood and stepped back. "I'm leaving," Callahan said. "I'm spending Christmas in the Poconos, away from this, away from all of you. My business remains mine. My clients remain mine. And if anyone from Mercer Properties contacts me or my clients, I'll file harassment charges and release everything I've found to the state attorney general." He walked out through the side entrance, the folder tucked under his arm, leaving behind a dining room dissolving into accusations and denials. Through the windows he could see people gathering coats, several families already heading for their cars. His grandmother caught up with him in the driveway, moving with surprising speed for her age. "I have a cabin in the Poconos," she said. "Take the keys, stay as long as you need." She pressed them into his hand, then gripped his shoulder. "You did the right thing." Callahan drove away as more cars started leaving, headlights cutting through the December darkness. His phone began buzzing before he reached the highway, cousins, aunts, uncles, all wanting his side of the story, all suddenly remembering they'd always believed in him. He turned it off and kept driving, the lights of Bergen County fading behind him. Chapter 5: Retaliation and Resilience. The workshop door rattled violently at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Christmas. Callahan was running a piece of walnut through the planer when Blaine's voice cut through the machine's whine. "Open up, Cal, we need to talk." Callahan killed the power and approached the door cautiously. Through the reinforced glass, his brother looked like he hadn't slept in days. The expensive suit was wrinkled, the confident posture replaced by something jagged and desperate. "I'm working," Callahan said through the door, "and we have nothing to discuss." 50-50 partnership, Blaine said, his palm pressed against the glass. "I bring capital and business connections. You provide the craftsmanship and reputation. We both win." The audacity of it stole Callahan's breath for a moment. "You're not serious." "I'm completely serious. Look, the family thing got messy, but that's behind us now. This is business, pure business. I have access to clients with real money, people who'd pay premium prices for custom work. You're leaving money on the table doing this alone." "The answer is no. Leave my property, Blaine." His brother's expression shifted, the desperation hardening into something uglier. "You're making a mistake." "Serious mistake." Callahan locked the door after Blaine left and returned to work, but the encounter left him unsettled. He'd underestimated his brother's capacity for denial, his ability to reframe theft and betrayal as mere complications to be overcome. The harassment started small. A client called that afternoon to cancel a commission, apologetic but firm. She'd received an anonymous email with concerns about Callahan's business stability and ability to complete projects on time. 2 more cancellations followed by week's end, each citing similar vague concerns from unnamed sources. Then the online reviews appeared. 1-star ratings on every platform, all posted within a 48-hour period, all describing experiences that never happened. Delayed deliveries, poor craftsmanship, unprofessional behavior. Callahan spent an entire day documenting each fake review, noting the creation dates of the accounts and the identical phrasing patterns. The phone calls began at 2 in the morning, heavy breathing, then silence, sometimes music playing. Once, Blaine's voice, slurred with alcohol, rambling about family loyalty and betrayal before the line went dead. Callahan started keeping a log, noting every call with timestamps and any identifying information. The attempted break-in happened on a Sunday night. Callahan had installed security cameras after the harassment escalated, and they captured everything in grainy night vision clarity. A figure in dark clothing attempting to jimmy the workshop's side door, then trying windows, finally giving up after the motion sensor lights triggered. The footage wasn't clear enough for positive identification, but the build and movement patterns matched Blaine perfectly. Callahan gathered everything: the documented client interference, screenshots of fake reviews with IP address data his tech-savvy cousin had helped trace, phone logs, security footage, and filed for a restraining order. The hearing took 20 minutes. Judge, a woman in her 60s who'd seen too many cases of family business disputes turning ugly, granted a 2-year order of protection without hesitation. Blaine violated it within 24 hours, showing up at the workshop parking lot and shouting threats until a neighboring business owner called the police. The contempt charges came swiftly, accompanied by criminal penalties for harassment and attempted breaking and entering. Callahan watched his brother being escorted from the courthouse in handcuffs, feeling nothing but exhausted relief. His grandmother appeared at the workshop 3 days later, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression she reserved for serious business discussions. She'd been a silent partner in her husband's early ventures, Callahan knew, before the company grew large enough that her contributions were erased from its official history. "I want to invest," she said without preamble, 15% equity for $200,000. "I've had my attorney draw up the papers." "You don't need to do this," Callahan said. "I'm managing fine." "This isn't charity, it's a sound business decision. I've reviewed your books, your client retention rates, your growth trajectory. You're undervalued and undercapitalized. With proper investment, you could triple your revenue within 2 years. She set the portfolio on his workbench. "I'm 83 years old. I'd like to see my money do something meaningful before I die, and I'd rather invest in someone who builds things than someone who destroys them." Callahan signed the papers that afternoon. The capital injection transformed everything. He hired 2 skilled craftsmen he'd been training informally, both recent graduates from a woodworking program who brought fresh techniques and genuine passion. He upgraded equipment, expanded the workshop into the adjacent bay, and finally had breathing room to take on larger commissions without sacrificing quality. The solo show at Forge and Grain Gallery happened because his grandmother knew the owner, but it succeeded because the work spoke for itself. Callahan spent 6 months preparing, creating pieces that showcased both traditional joinery and contemporary design. A dining table in figured maple with waterfall edges, chairs that balanced sculptural beauty with ergonomic comfort, a credenza in walnut and brass that seemed to float above the floor. The opening night drew a crowd that spilled onto the sidewalk. Collectors, designers, architects, and people who simply appreciated craftsmanship moved through the gallery with reverent attention. By the time the evening ended, Callahan had $67,000 in orders and a waiting list that stretched into the following year. The magazine features followed organically. A design publication photographed his workshop for a profile on emerging craftsmen. An architecture magazine commissioned him for a piece about the intersection of traditional techniques and modern aesthetics. Each article brought new clients, more sophisticated projects, higher profile commissions. The exclusive showroom deal came from a boutique furniture store in Tribeca whose owner had attended the gallery show. They wanted to represent his work, offering prominent display space and handling all sales logistics in exchange for a reasonable commission. Callahan negotiated terms that protected his creative control while expanding his market reach exponentially. Meanwhile, Blaine's legal troubles compounded. The embezzlement investigation that Callahan's documentation had triggered uncovered layers of fraud beyond what he'd initially discovered. Federal prosecutors built a case involving wire fraud, falsified business records, and money laundering. The evidence was overwhelming, the paper trail damning. Blaine took a plea deal, 18 months in federal prison, full restitution of stolen funds, and permanent prohibition from holding fiduciary positions. He'd serve his time at a minimum security facility, but the conviction would follow him forever, a scarlet letter in the business world he'd once navigated with such arrogant confidence. Mercer Properties filed for bankruptcy 6 months after Christmas. The company Callahan's grandfather had built, that had defined his family's identity for 3 generations, dissolved into liquidation proceedings and creditor negotiations. His parents downsized to a modest home in Ridgewood, the estate sold to cover debts. The Range Rovers disappeared, replaced by practical sedans. The charity galas and country club memberships evaporated like morning fog. Callahan felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only a distant sadness for what might have been if they'd chosen honesty over appearance, substance over status. His grandmother attended the bankruptcy proceedings with grim determination, ensuring she recovered what she could for other defrauded investors, but she never spoke about it afterward. Instead, she visited Callahan's expanded workshop, running her hands over new pieces in progress, asking questions about his growing team and upcoming commissions. She'd framed the first magazine feature and hung it in her modest apartment, telling anyone who'd listen about her grandson, the master craftsman, the one who'd built something real with his own hands and refused to let anyone take it from him.